Hello and welcome to my February reading wrap up. My very first video in my new setup. In case you missed my moving vlog, I moved to Sweden. I'm in Sweden. Today I just want to talk about every single book I read in February. Unfortunately, since I travel, I didn't bring the books I read physically with me. I just left them behind in storage, so that's why I'm holding the cup of tea, because I can't actually hold up most of these books, unfortunately. But we'll still talk about them, and I'll put up a little picture. As usual, I try to organize these videos into like sections instead of me just talking about books for however long, because I had so many 3.5 star books this month. Like I had so many books that had a similar rating, so I thought it'd be fun if I talked about every single book I read in the order of my ratings, like from worst to best. So that is what we're gonna be doing today. It may get a little bit quirky, it's my first time doing it in that style, but I thought I'd switch it up for you and make one big February ranking. This was a pretty good reading month for me, considering all the chaos and the packing and everything. I read 12 books, so I think we're past the reading slump of January for sure. I'm still not necessarily at the pace that I was in my DC apartment when I didn't have any other activities to do, so I was just reading all day. I'm still going to try to make a concerted effort to continue on my TBR because I have so many books with me. I plan to read them all in the next 6 months. So if you want a preview of what the next 6 months look like, it looks something like that stack over there. Like I said, I'll just jump in by talking about the very first book, which happens to also be the very first book I read this month, which also was unfortunately the worst book I read this month. A lot of my worst ratings are like disappointments in terms of I had higher expectations, because God did I have higher expectations for this book. That is Heavenly Tyrant by Xiran Zhao. Now, I mentioned in my December wrap-up that I reread Iron Widow in like expectation of this book coming out. And when I reread Iron Widow, I was like, okay, I've kind of grown out of this style of writing, but it was still good. I reread Iron Widow and I think I gave that reread like 4 stars. Like I still enjoyed it, although it wasn't necessarily the 5-star it was when I read it when I was younger. But I still thought Iron Widow was really good, so I still had high expectations for Heavenly Tyrant. I bought the book the day it came out. This has been like, I was really, really excited to see where she would take this because I like the author a lot. Unfortunately, this was just a bizarre book, frankly. I think I mentioned this in my vlogs, but I could like do a whole video essay on what was wrong with this book and what it tried to do right, but went so wrong. Like, that's even worse or even better, I guess, than a book that isn't trying to do anything, but then is just bad. This book was trying to do good things that I could see. It just did them so unbelievably poorly. Like, this book took a discussion about workers' revolution, communism, socialism, and the problems with that when you have like also a dictatorship involved, when it can't really be a communist revolution with a dictator and all of those things. It also has the main character in an extremely abusive relationship, a very uneven power dynamic relationship, and watching her overcome that could have been really, really interesting. It could have been really impactful. The discussions of communism and socialism and those kinds of things could have been so impactful, especially in this time and age, for a young adult audience, but it ended up being, I would say on the politics front, it ended up just being like TikTok rhetoric of like, you know, like when people try to just make things as clear as possible and as straightforward as possible and just reciting things to you. That's what this book was. It was literally probably like 300 pages worth of the 500-page book, just reciting socialist talking points from like TikTok, like young people. I'm not like actual theory. Like I do not believe that this author has read Marx. I do not believe that she really did the research into explaining this in a way that isn't just like spoon feeding her version of events to the reader. And it was just done really, really poorly, where like every single character that the main character meets is kind of like a caricature from like a political ad where they're like, I have something to tell you about the state of the world. And it's like, I don't believe that's a real character. That's not a real like flesh and blood character that has like a purpose on the page other than to recite things to the reader. And then in terms of the relationship, I don't want to give any spoilers about the book, but I will just warn you that the rating of this book goes up to new adult. The series is previously young adult, but that seems to be like an informal rating change. I don't really know how these things work, but I saw that the author said you can't switch the rating in the middle of a series, and then in which case I'm like, why did you? The rating change was so unnecessary to the plot. The sex scene was incredibly non-consensual, but the author tries to like make it consensual because the main character is girl bossing to get what she wants. it's just really terrible. It was just honestly terrible. Their safe word during sex, their safe word was private property. So why is this not 1 star, you may ask? Because I had a fun time reading it. It was really funny. It was like, when I put my review, I think I said that it was like, I don't know how accurate this is, but it's like 4th wing for queer people. It's not, but I thought like it was a silly, goofy time, but that's not at all what the book was trying to be. The book was trying to teach a young adult audience something when it's not even for young adults anymore. And I'm like, I'm sorry, the writing is just not good enough to make it new adult. Like, nothing worked with this book. I will probably still read the 3rd book because I really want to know how the romance happened, and I really like the last 20 pages. So maybe once we get past this speed bump, we'll get into like something good. But yeah, it was really, really bad. What a disappointment. Oh god, speaking of disappointments, this next book is a little weird because this is technically out of order. I'll mention I read both Legendborn and Bloodmarked, the first 2 books in the series, in the Legendborn series. Legendborn is the first one, so maybe I should talk about that one first, except we're going in order of rating, and Bloodmarked is in the bottom tier, so I'll talk about Legendborn in a little bit, but Bloodmarked, unfortunately, was a 2.5 star for me. I read Bloodmarked by Tracy Deonn pretty recently, like I finished it only a little while ago. I talked about it in my last vlog. I read it while I was traveling on my phone and my Kindle. And I read it pretty soon after the first book, so I don't know what switched for me so incredibly here, but here's another sequel to a first book that I thought was really strong, another first book YA book that I thought was really strong, and then the second book, the romance just killed me. I could not stand the romantic interest in this book. He annoyed the living daylights out of me. I would love to read a YA series where the main character doesn't get in a romantic relationship. Because honestly in this book, I think what Bree needs is to be single. The main character. I think she needs to work on herself and be with herself and work on her grief in her own time and not be like constantly flirting with angry, annoying asshole men. But that's my hot take on this book because I know a lot of other people love it and I know that people probably love the main love interest. God knows I have terrible taste when it comes to love interest. No one ever agrees with me. But I really, really disliked him. I won't give his name because I think that might be a spoiler. But I will just say he is like a dark romance caricature that she picked up, like she plucked up and put in a YA romance where he's like, oh, you can't do this. Like, I won't let you leave my line of sight. I have to see you at all times. And I'm like, oh, you are both 17 years old, shut up. And then they're like flirting the whole book and it was just so painfully cringy and awkward. I had such bad secondhand embarrassment that I like couldn't enjoy anything else about the book. And I think in general also this book just wasn't as strong as the first book. The first book had a very set setting. We'll talk about that later, but like it was on one setting versus Bloodmarked was jumping around to all these different locations and the author didn't really handle that in a good way. The characters kind of just appeared places with like very tenuous plot holding them to those locations because she knew the emotional beats she wanted the characters to land on, but the author didn't really know like how to fill in the space between those moments. So it felt way more like jumpy and choppy than the first book did. And there were definitely some scenes that felt super unnecessary and were just put in for the sake of guiding the romance, which I always think is dumb and unnecessary and don't ruin the plot just so you can further your romance. But yeah, that was book Bloodmarked. Mega disappointed me, especially because I liked Legendborn so much, and I'm still deciding whether or not I want to read the third book, Oathbound, that comes out shortly, because this was a rough one for me. Okay, now we have a bit of a star jump. Those two were my only like real flops of the month. Everything else went really, really well, which I think helped with the reading slump. We're now up to my pretty decent books. These were kind of hard to rate because I gave all of these the same rating, and I feel like whenever I rate books, they're like within my own experience of reading them and within their own genre and expectations. So the ratings may not align with what they actually should be, but some books I hold to higher standards, okay? If I was really excited for a book and it disappoints me, it gets a lower rating than a book that I wasn't expecting much from. I read this month probably my most anticipated release of the whole year. Maybe this was my like second most anticipated release after Emily Wilde, and that is The Golden Raven by Nora Savavic. If you don't know, like my guilty pleasure, one of my favorite series that I just like adore, even though it's like not objectively like the best series ever written, but like I'm obsessed with. is the All for the Game book series. I talked about that before on my channel when I talk about like my favorite guilty pleasure books. I don't really think it's a guilty pleasure. I genuinely think there are parts of these books that are so genius. The character building and the way that characters react to one another and to certain situations is very smart, and I'm willing to forgive a lot of like crazy plot things when the characters are well written, because sometimes crazy shit happens in life, and as long as the characters react like in character to those things, I end up loving the book. So yeah, that is the background. I love this series. This is the Golden Raven is the second book in the like follow-up series. There's an original trilogy, and now there's going to be a second trilogy following up on the story from the Sunshine Court of a romance between Jean, who is a Xe player who joins a new team from his previous very, very, very toxic, extremely violent, extremely abusive team. And his new team is incredibly kind and understanding, and their captain, Jeremy, is his love interest for the series. Nora does slow burn, so like they haven't actually like done any romance, but it's still obvious that they are going to end up together. The series is largely about Jean recovering from the horrendous things that happened to him in the original trilogy, and even more horrendous shit that comes up that happened to him that we didn't even know about in this book. So it's about his like recovery path. The first book that I read last year, that came out last year, The Sunshine Court, I gave 5 stars, loved. Unfortunately, The Golden Raven, I don't think it's that my enjoyment has changed that much. I think that this book was really, really unnecessarily long. Like, it felt like the series was originally supposed to be a duology, and it felt like I could tell which parts were a part of the author's original draft and which parts she like added in because she realized not enough time was passing. Like, there's way too many side characters. There's probably like, she tries to really introduce us to like every single person on this sports team that has like 30 people. And it gets very confusing, and it sort of waters down all the characters. And normally Nora's characters are like a highlight of her books. But they all kind of like blended together in this one. And honestly, I just have to say, like, the whole point is that Jean is like in a safe place where like he can recover from what happened to him. But Nora doesn't really like writing boring stories. She likes things happening. So like things keep happening to this poor boy. And then in order to like make it not too harsh on him, she also has things happening in this book to the original characters from the original series, but we don't get it from their perspective at all. It's just like for background drama. And I'm like, okay, that's fine. It was just very chaotic. I just feel like she wrote and published this book. Like, it hasn't even been a year since the first book came out, and she wrote and published this whole thing in this whole time. And I just feel like she could have taken her time with it and gone back and done harder edits and would have cleaned it up so much. But this is a self-published book, and it was 99 cents on my Kindle, and I love Nora, and I love the series, and I love any glimpse into these characters that I can get. So I'm not really complaining, and that's why I'm giving it 3.5 stars, even though like it had a lot of issues, because I still love these characters and I love this world. Just not as good as the first book, but I hope she really takes her time with the third book. Like, I'm not in any particular hurry to get that. I'd rather she took her time and that it slayed as much as the last books did, because this book didn't work for me. But I might still reread it and try to catch more moments of things that I missed in the future. We'll see. Now I want to go reread the original books instead, because I want to remind myself how good they are, because now I'm like, were they that good? I hate books that do that. I hate books in a series that make me think like, were the previous books even that good? That is my pet peeve. Continuing on in the 3.5 star range, I give a lot of books 3.5 stars because it's like 3 feels so mean, but they're not 4-star books, so we're giving them 3.5. The next book was The Traitor Queen by Danielle Jensen. I also gave the first book in this series, The Bridge Kingdom, 3.5 stars. I feel like they're solid books for what they are. They achieve good romance, they achieve good fantasy. I also think for romantasy, the world building is reasonably solid and clean. I like the way that Danielle Jensen does her world building for romantasy. She's like, I know you're here for the romance, so I'm just gonna make very clean, easy to follow world dynamics. Kingdom, 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 they're at war, they have trade agreements. And I'm just gonna follow that. And I really appreciate that. Like, she keeps it clean but still interesting in order to be able to focus on the romance rather than like trying to build some complicated world that she's never going to address fully because the romance is the focus. Yeah, other than that, I will just say like the series isn't like anything crazy original. Like it does feel like it's kind of been done before. And also the main character is always naked. I'm just like, the main character, God, I've already forgotten her name. I read 2 books about this character in the last 2 months and I've already forgotten her name. Okay, sorry. The main character of this book, whose name I'm not currently remembering, is always naked. And I noticed this in the first book, like she's always like wearing a white sheer dress in the rain, or she's like swimming in a pond and people are spying on her, or they strip her naked to put her in the stocks as a punishment for stealing. And I'm just like, can this girl put it away? Like put on some clothes. No one, and it would make more sense, I guess, if like nudity was like a part of the world building. It's not. Everyone else has clothes on. She just doesn't, which is just a little annoying. It didn't actually ruin my enjoyment of the story or anything, but yeah, I did finish that book and went, okay, it's done. Am I still reading book 3? Yeah, kind of. I'm interested in how the world building plot is going to resolve itself, and I'm curious about, she did a pretty good job in setting up the side romances that are going to be occurring in the future books, because not all the books are about the same main couple, they're switching couples, and she did a pretty good job at setting up interest in those couples, so I will probably keep going. I don't leave series unfinished, so since I'm on a roll with this series, might as well just see it through. The next book might be kind of a surprise that I put it this low, and that is Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin. I talked about this quite a bit in the reading vlog where I read it, but this book is really beautiful as a contemporary book. I feel like so many contemporary books I read just do the same thing. It's like these 2 characters who are like both kind of miserable people make each other miserable, but they both love it. And it's just like, okay, well, yeah, I've read this before. But that wasn't really the problem because it could have still been done well. Reading this book, like the first 100 pages, there were just certain things about the author's interjections about politics that felt very like dated. Even though this book only came out in 2021, it felt kind of dated. It felt kind of like, it was just giving me an ick. And then I went and did my own research on the author, which also gave me the ick. And that kind of just colored my experience for reading the rest of the book. Like I couldn't really shake that feeling of like, while reading it. So that didn't help. And then also I didn't really vibe with the main characters very much. I didn't really think that they should be together or that they should be in a romantic relationship. All the character details we get about them are that they're very, very similar. They're both stubborn and uncommunicative and can't work things out together. And then I'm like, well then why would they be together? Shouldn't they be with someone who like can complement their communication style, not like clash with it? So I just didn't believe in the main through line of the story. And the only character I really loved, I love the character of Marks. And he's done dirty by this book. He was like my saving grace. Like he's why this book is rated so highly, because I loved Marks and I loved the journey that we get with Marks in this book. I was just kind of disappointed in the ending, disappointed in the main characters, disappointed in the author. So it's a 3.5 star, but it is still a really beautifully written book. I can't like objectively say that it's like a 2-star written book because it's really well written and really well put together, but it didn't really work for me personally. Oh, and then I also read 2 graphic novel issues this month that I'll talk about really briefly. I don't think I have mentioned at all that I am reading Saga, which is a sci-fi graphic novel series about a planet and a moon that are at war, and they're 2 different people, and they've kind of been at war for hundreds of years, thousands of years even. A couple, like a kind of Romeo and Juliet situation occurs where a woman from the planet and a man from the moon, they fall in love, and they end up having a baby who is like a hybrid of the 2 races, which has never before been done. So they're kind of being hunted down by the governments because of this baby. Like a hybrid baby can't exist. It would prove that these races can get along and they can't have that. Like they don't think it's scientifically possible. So they're being sort of chased down. I read the first 3 issues, volume 1, 2, and 3 back in August. It's been so long. And I loved them. I gave them all 5 stars. That original arc, that first 3-volume arc was just incredible. It hit on all the right moments. It covered so much story, even with so few words, because they're graphic novels, and I loved it. This month, I finally picked up volume 4 and volume 5, but I'll first talk about volume 4 because it's in my 3.5 star range. Didn't really work for me the way the first 3 volumes did. I don't really know. I feel like it was kind of missing those like strong character beat moments that we had from the first 3 volumes. And it did sort of act more as like a transitionary volume. Like it felt more like, oh, we wrote these first 3 volumes, they were incredible. How do we transition into the rest of the story now, into what else is gonna happen? That was kind of volume 4. So it wasn't bad, it just didn't necessarily, it wasn't there for the oomph, it was there to continue the story, which I think is also a useful thing to do. If all like 11 or 12 or however many issues this is gonna end up being, if they all hit really, really hard, it would kind of end up losing effect after a while. They have to like build up storylines. So volume 4 was fine, was good, but nothing crazy. And then I guess I can talk about my 4-star books when I talk about volume 5, because volume 5 was one of my 4-star reads for the month. I really, really liked volume 5. I didn't necessarily get the same like feeling in my chest as I got reading the first 3 volumes, but I think it's possible that it just wasn't the right time. So I'm kind of waiting right now to read volume 6 until I'm really in a sci-fi mood. My 4 stars are always like books that are really good that I didn't personally like attached to, you know? So it's always a personal choice separating a 4-star from a 5-star. But yeah, I really like volume 5. I felt like it gets back into the strength of this series, which is talking about like politics and proxy war and conflict that I always think is so interesting, and they do so well through a graphic medium. We get reintroduced to some characters that I adored from the first 3 volumes, which, oh god, I've already forgotten. Gwendolyn and Lion Cat and the girl that I don't really remember the name right now, but we get reintroduced to those characters and I love them, and I loved how ridiculous their arc in this book was, but also like how devastating. Like that's like really what this series is all about. It's all about things that seem really ridiculous on the outside, but are really like heart-wrenching. And you're like, yeah, can I feel this much emotion about a man with a TV as a head? Yeah, I can. I really do care about this man with a TV on his head, you know? So that's what I love about this series, and I think this volume kind of gets back to it a little bit more than volume 4. But I will continue Saga, and you'll probably hear updates, but I won't talk about it a ton. I do count my graphic novels as books that I read, because I do put like energy into understanding them and analyzing them and like thinking about them, and they do serve a reader's purpose. I just don't necessarily count the pages as pages read, because they're like graphic novel pages, so they don't really count as pages read, but otherwise I still count these in my book counts overall. It feels so weird to be talking about these books that I read in California in the snow. Like, it feels wrong somehow. I also read a collection of short stories this month called Gods of Want by K-Ming Chang. This has been on my bookshelf for ages, and I really, really wanted to read it. I picked it up at the same time in 2023, I actually think. In 2023, I picked this up at the same time as I picked up The Crooked Plow. Just like as books I randomly saw in a bookshop that I wanted to read. I love The Crooked Plow. I didn't quite love this, which sucks because it's a very weird collection of short stories. Like, it's very experimental in writing, which usually really works for me. I really enjoy it. There were just some stories that didn't necessarily hit. That's the problem with these short story collections. It's like some of the short stories, 5 stars. Other ones, 3 stars. Some of them were 4 stars. So that's why I'm giving the collection as a whole 4 stars, because it can't really be 5 stars if there was something I would consider not perfect. But I still really liked these short stories. They're specifically focused on themes of sapphic relationships, on the immigrant experience, on the Taiwanese experience, and sisterhood and mother-daughter relationships and all of those things. And I was kind of obsessed in the beginning with reading these stories, and I was trying to put them together in like a cohesive narrative. They're not really, they're just kind of random. They just kind of jump back and forth. And there were certain stories that I loved and that like I really sat and thought about afterwards. And there are others like not so much, but I'm happy to give it a shout out that there were parts I like, especially if you like weird books, if you like experimental fiction, things like that. I would definitely give this collection a shot, because I don't know, maybe I was just too dumb the day I read this to like grasp everything she was saying, but I still enjoyed it, had a good time, yeah. And then going back, I can finally talk about Legendborn, which was the first book in the series with Bloodmarked. I'm doing this all out of order, whatever. Because I gave Legendborn 4 stars, and I really, really liked it. I think the only parts that I didn't really like was just like a little bit too YA, a little bit of secondhand embarrassment. Like, I remember complaining to my friend that, why does the main character always sprint away from arguments with people? Like, she's having an argument with someone in like a public place, and like she can't handle it anymore, so she just starts running in the opposite direction, and I'm like, there was no better way you could have written her like escaping conversations. I liked Legendborn a lot. I had a good time with it. Reading it on my phone, I really love the main character, like I said, and this first book especially, I think nails the themes that carry this series, like themes on grief and talking about racism and talking about racial dynamics in a university setting and in like old boys club settings and things like that. I think this book like really nails it for a YA audience. And I love her magic system and her world building, like the way that she brings in Arthurian magic and balances it out by being like, well, there's magic in this part of the world, so then there also has to be magic for this part of the world. There is magic everywhere, depending on the person, depending on the source. And I thought that was really cool and interesting, and I wish she'd continued that in Bloodmarked, because as we've already discussed, I thought Bloodmarked was a really, really poor sequel. But I really liked Legendborn, and I still kind of recommend the series, because I know that there are some people who like loved Legendborn so much that carried them through Bloodmarked. And for me, I just got caught up on a couple of annoying elements in Bloodmarked that made it so I couldn't enjoy that. But I think that there are definitely tons of people who do and would and will. I definitely still recommend picking up the series if you're into YA fantasy, because I think for a YA fantasy, it's incredibly good, especially the first book. And then I only have one book that I gave 4.5 stars this month, and that is Intermezzo by Sally Rooney. I'm so sad I don't have my annotated copy with me, but I read Intermezzo and I've kind of been saving it since it came out in September. I bought it like the day it came out, but I picked it up and I realized I was like, I have to read this book when I'm in the perfect mood for Sally Rooney. And I will say I was in the perfect mood for Sally Rooney this month. I would say I loved this book just as much as I loved Beautiful World, Where Are You? Just as much as I loved Conversations with Friends, but not quite as much as I love Normal People, which I think is why it's at 4.5 and not 5 stars, because I can't help but compare it in that case. I really like Intermezzo. It's the story of two brothers, one and the 3 women that they're in relationships with. The younger brother, Ivan, is in a relationship with an older woman. The older brother, Peter, is both in a relationship with a younger woman in her early 20s, but also still is in love with his childhood sweetheart who like broke up with him and dumped him for reasons that I think are still a little bit confusing. I don't really get. But I think what kind of docked this down a star, despite it being like a really beautiful story about brothers and love and relationships, there's just a lot of sex in this book. I'm not a prude, okay? I swear I'm not. Why do I keep on complaining about sex? Maybe it's because when I like the characters, then I enjoy it. But I don't read Sally Rooney because I want to read sex scenes. And the first half of this book were so many sex scenes that you cannot skip because there's crucial plot occurring in those sex scenes. But once again, Sally Rooney's writing carries. I love the way she writes. And the ending between the brothers was so emotional and so good. I just wish we'd gotten more of the brothers throughout. It's always so weird. I'm complaining about this book so much. I spend more time explaining why I docked it down half a star than explaining why I gave it 4.5 stars in the first place. Sorry. But I really, really did like it. Like, objectively, you don't need me to tell you that Sally Rooney's books are good. Yeah, I don't need to explain to you why the book is good. I'm just explaining why like it didn't work for me necessarily. Hence the half-star dock. But I did think when I was reading it, I was like, I'm gonna reread this book when I'm in my 30s, and maybe it's gonna hit so much harder, because so much of the discussion of this book was about age or age differences or age relationships or conversations between people at different stages in their lives and all of those things. I think it might hit a lot harder for me when I'm at a different stage of my life, so I can sort of compare the experiences of these characters, the younger ones and the older ones, better. Right now, I'm only really feeling connected to the younger ones because I'm younger, so I'm gonna hold on to this book, and maybe in 10 years on this channel, I'll reread it and give a fresh opinion. Okay, I have a fresh cup of tea, so we will continue. I just want to be in the right mindset to talk about my 5-star books this month. 2025 is my year where I'm getting way pickier with ratings, so try not to compare the way I rated books in 2024 to 2025, because I am trying to be a lot more like, only perfect books in my heart and soul get 5 stars. But I did find 2 perfect books this month. The first one, I don't have my copy with me right now because I didn't want to fly with it, but it should be no surprise to you that my first 5-star read of the month was Jade War by Fonda Lee. This book is the sequel to Jade City, and I loved it. Jade City I also liked reasonably enough. I gave it 4 stars in my old rating system. Maybe more was like 3.5. I liked Jade City, but I didn't necessarily think that the violence in it like spoke to the plot as well. It kind of just like felt like one of those fantasy books that are like violence for the sake of violence because people think it's cool and edgy, which isn't necessarily true, but it's just how I felt when I was reading it. Again, my review's not objective, very subjective. But Jade War just was perfectly balanced in terms of political plot and political scheming and a couple of action sequences and violence in moments in which the effects could be clearly seen in the narrative on the downstream effects. Deaths that were both impactful and meaningful and served the plot in like an imperfect, incredible way. Yeah, this book was just, I couldn't wait to pick it up. It wasn't like there was like, I had the perfect time to read a book in that moment. Like, I was very busy, I was very stressed. But whenever I was doing something else, I was thinking in the back of my head, I was like, I want to be in Janloon right now. I want to be reading Jade War right now. And I'm still thinking that, which is why Jade Legacy is down here. And I will be picking up Jade Legacy within the next month because I'm very, very excited to continue on with the series and get back into the world and get back to these characters. Even though I'm terrified about which of the main characters is going to die in the final book. But I think I'm emotionally equipped to handle it. We'll see. If I start reading it and I'm starting to get like anxiously depressed, I might Google who survives. I'm one of those people, sorry. Death is one of those things I spoil for myself in books because otherwise it makes me way too anxious. So nervous, but very excited to get back to Jade Legacy. I just think Jade War is the perfect follow-up. It's so funny, both of my 5-star books are sequels. And then both of my 2-star books were also sequels. That's kind of a fun balance. The example of sequels done wrong versus sequels done right. Jade War, sequel done right. It carries through the parts of the first book that were good while building upon it. So while the first book might have been a little bit weighed down with world building and getting situated, the second book uses the time you spent getting situated and getting to understand the world, and now just explodes that world even bigger and build upon it the right amount without continuing to overwhelm the reader, and like continues the through line relationships, and it just doesn't feel like a different book. It feels like a continuation of the same story getting closer and closer to the end. You know what I mean? Needless to say, Jade War, incredible stuff. My last book that I want to talk about for February should be no surprise. It is technically cheating because it's a reread, but this was a reread that meant a lot to me because on my first read, I didn't understand what was happening in this book. So the whole reason I'm rereading the Locked Tomb series was actually to reread this book and try to understand it better. I did. I still feel like I could reread it and get more out of it, absolutely. Like, I don't feel like I understand everything now, but I understand so much more about this world and what Tamsyn Muir is doing with this story than I did before. And I loved the series before, but now I genuinely think that this is the best book series on the planet. And Alecto, please be just as good. I'm sure it will be. Like, I really don't think Alecto can get it wrong, but like, don't embarrass me like this. Because I do think right now this is like the best book series that exists. It's incredible. One thing I just love about these books that I really appreciate about Tamsyn Muir as an author is she trusts her readers. She's like, I'm not gonna hold your hand through this. I'm gonna create the art that I'm going to create. And there are gonna be amazing through lines and amazing world building and amazing plot. And it's gonna be confusing, and I'm sorry, but I believe that you can work through it. And you know what? I did work through it. I annotated the ever-loving shit out of this book. It is so thoroughly annotated with underlining and being like, wait, does this connect to this in Nona? Or are we gonna follow up on this in Alecto? And that experience of loving a book so much to want to be able to underline like every line as important, it's so special. And I think everyone should read this series because I think objectively they are perfect books that carry through a perfect story and build up amazing side characters and amazing main characters. And it may not resonate for you personally. Like, obviously, again, reviews are subjective, so the series may not resonate personally for you as much as it did for me, but I don't think that takes away from the fact that Tamsyn Muir is a genius and that her books are genius and that this series is genius. Because it is. It's incredible. Like, obviously, I already loved the main characters the first time I read it, but this book, because I already knew I loved the main characters, I was really able to focus on the side characters who I didn't pay as much attention to the first reread. They are so rich and lush and incredible. And this is a sci-fi series in which there's necromancy as an art. They're living in a series of planets occupied by necromancers, and each planet focuses on a different branch of necromancy. So in the first book, in my very first reread, I remember when characters died, I was like, no, it's so sad, what am I gonna do? And now my reread, I'm like, well, they're dead, but like, they're all necromancers. So like, now this reread, I really paid attention to characters that died, and I cared about them, and I tabbed for deaths, and I paid more attention to that element of the story, because I've learned, just because a character dies doesn't mean that they're not narratively important. I've learned my lesson. Yeah, I could keep talking about this book forever, but really just reading this was just such a special experience. If you have read the series, if you haven't read the series, read it. If you've read the series once, reread it. If you read the series twice, reread it. If you haven't annotated it, annotate it, because I think that there's, like, part of Tamsyn Muir's genius is that there's so much more to be discovered about this book. Like, there's things, I think, even on this reread, even with all my annotating, I think I probably missed some things that were unimportant. I'm sure after Alecto comes out, I'm gonna want to reread this again and be like, oh my god, I can't believe I missed all of these things setting up for Alecto. Funny story, I did my first YouTuber fail where I just sort of talked at the camera for 20 minutes and then I went and checked on it and my phone had died. So, welcome back. You missed the ending of my Harrow rant, which won't be nearly as emotional because it's been like 20 minutes of charging for me, but I loved it. I don't even remember, I think I left off just talking about the genius of Tamsyn Muir. She's a genius. I wish I knew what else I'd said about this. I'll leave it at, you should read the series, it's incredible. I'm gonna start my reread of Nona soon, and I'm the most excited. And low-key, I think after finishing Nona, I might just have to restart and reread the whole series again. So, that is that. So those were all the books I read in February, ranked from worst to best. Thank you so much for sticking around to this part of the video. If you did, leave a comment, a like, a subscribe, whatever you want. I really, really appreciate this community on BookTube. I've gotten some incredibly, incredibly sweet comments recently that have just like made me feel so warm and nice inside, that people watch these videos and enjoy them and think that I'm halfway decent at this, because I'm still learning and I still want to get better. But I really appreciate the people that are sticking around in the meantime. Oh god, there were people walking in the background. My bad. This is my current setup. I'm still working on it, so apologize for any lighting in the meantime. But for now, I will get back to the snow, get back to my snowy related books and my snowy related activities while I still can, while it's still winter here. And I will see you in the next video very soon. Toodles!